Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pocket Politics. Today, we're in for a special episode as we welcome a guest on today's episode, Avery James. Mr. James is a research analyst at a Republican-leaning Virginian polling firm, Echelon Insights. He attended American University, where he received a degree in political science and economics. Unfortunately, one of our co-hosts, Audit, can't make it tonight. But without further ado, we're going to turn it over to Avery, who's going to be talking about his polls about presidential approval ratings. Avery, please take it away, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Andy. It's a great honor to be on the show, and I'm really excited to share with you and your audience some of our findings here at Echelon Insights. We're a polling firm that leans Republican based in Alexandria, Virginia, just outside of DC. And last month, we decided to do a little bit of survey work looking at what voters think about previous presidents. You know, we often talk about politics. What are the issues? What are the demographics? But I think that this particular angle gives a unique perspective on how not just the political parties, but in particular, certain groups within the political parties look at some of our former presidents going all the way back to JFK. So I'm going to share with you now some of our findings, and you should be able to see it right there on the screen from our slide deck. You'll notice that our first deck here, we've got Kennedy and Reagan at the top of the list. No real surprises if you've followed some kind of political histories. John F. Kennedy is just overwhelmingly beloved at 77% somewhat or strong approval. I think about 8% in the likely electorate disapprove of him. If you'll look closely, you'll notice, of course, that we're looking at a 2024 likely electorate nationwide. So what we're doing is through our modeling system, we're basically creating a projection of the likely voters to weight our respondents. And I'm happy to talk about that later on the show. But what we find right here, of course, is some of the things you might have heard by talking to older relatives, right? Kennedy, very, very popular. Ronald Reagan, second up, 67% approval. Then we go down to George H.W. Bush. We've got Barack Obama in a close fourth at 59%. George W. Bush, this might surprise some people, is actually now pretty much at like basically where Obama is in terms of total approval. People are looking at him favorably with 58% approval of his job, 56% for Bill Clinton. And then we start going further down the list. We've got Jimmy Carter, where we've got 49%, overall breaking in approval, but people clearly have some thoughts on his presidency. Donald Trump, like Barack Obama, has like the fewest unsure people. Very recent president, very closely divided, 48% approve, 50% disapprove. And then we've got Gerald Ford. You'll notice as we get to these older presidents, there's a larger chunk of unsure on the chart right there. LBJ, Richard Nixon, they round out the bottom. So just looking from JFK onwards, these are our findings on what likely voters that we're projecting, and of course surveying a sample of over 1,000 of, think about these presidents.
No, that's very interesting there, Avery. And just want to help the viewers who don't see us on video. And if you don't, please check us out on YouTube. But George W. Bush more popular than Bill Clinton here, which so shocking me. I talk to my parents all the time. They talk about how great the economy was under Clinton, and Bush ruined it. But yet in this poll here, we're seeing Bush at a 58% approval rating and Bill Clinton at 56. So I always wonder why that could be. That's something out of everything I see here. That's kind of right. Interesting to me.
And
yeah,
any listeners.
Let's give a rundown for the listeners, right? Like I think you were about to do there, Avery, right? So John F. Kennedy tops the poll, strongly, somewhat approve at 77%, strongly, somewhat disapprove at 8%, which means that gap between there is undecided. Reagan is 67%, strongly or somewhat approve, 23%, strongly, somewhat disapprove. H.W. Bush, 60% approve. Barack Obama, 59%. George W. Bush, 58%. Bill Clinton, 56%. Jimmy Carter, 49%. Donald Trump, 48%. Gerald Ford, 45%. LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, 39%. And Richard Nixon at 31%. Really interesting stuff. A lot of these numbers surprise me, Avery. Keep giving us the rundown.
Yeah, absolutely. And for all the people who are listening, I'm sure we can include a link to On Echelon Insights website where you can find in the news section all of these slides and more information where you can see the whole crosstab for our February survey, and stay tuned for our March omnibus polls. So right here, we're looking just at Republican leaning voters. So this is about half of our survey, and we're looking at their approval breakdown of the presidents. If you've talked to Republicans, Ronald Reagan is at the top, should not really surprise you. Right there, tied with him, of course, is Donald J. Trump. They're both at 87%, strongly, somewhat approve. As you go further down the poll, you find JFK is in third place. People just love Kennedy, and Republican-leaning voters love Kennedy too. We might have personal opinions about Kennedy, but that is what we're finding in the electorate. Then we go further down, H.W. Bush, W. Bush, they're at 73, 74% approval, right around there. Gerald Ford, 49%, big jump down. The Ford presidency, as you know, after Richard Nixon resigned, was kind of in this interlude of stagflation. He was the caretaker president, as some see. And you can tell there's a real dip in how Republican-leaning voters think about him compared to other recent Republican presidents. We've got LBJ, 31% approve, 40% disapprove. There's an interesting break to this as well when we go further into some of the Republican-leaning voters, but Johnson is up there after Kennedy. Then we've got Jimmy Carter at 33% approval, 53% disapprove. But finally, if you talk to Republicans like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, most recent Democrats who are not currently president, at the very bottom, right? You got 36% approval for Bill Clinton, 24% approval for Barack Obama, 60% disapprove of Clinton, 73% disapprove of Obama. So you can tell right here, again, there's like a gradient where the closer you get to President Day, the more controversial and the more polarizing these figures are between the parties.
Can we take a break and talk about this in
Absolutely.
increments? Is that all right? I mean, shook is me trying to sound like the kids,
Sure.
right? But I'm shook by several things on this slide. I mean, the fact that Carter is above Clinton or Obama really surprises me.
Yes.
And LBJ is as high as he is. Yeah, like only. And 74% of Republicans approve George W. Bush, but the Trump approval rating,
yes,
is nuts to me. 87%. I mean, only 1% is unsure about Trump, and
right.
I mean that makes sense. Nobody should be unsure about Trump, right? He tells us what he thinks, even when he shouldn't. But no, I'm really surprised, but only 3% are unsure about Obama. Now, I did have one question. Is there a reason you didn't include Joe Biden in these numbers?
So we do have a running track of both Biden's approval. We do in our omnibus, as well as on like several factors on foreign policy and economics. We do this every month. I'm happy to share those numbers. That's in another deck. But we were just looking at past presidents for the purposes of this.
Well, I just want to know, like, if he's trending better than Barack. Right? Like,
among Republican leaning, I doubt it. I imagine among Republican leaning, he's probably even underwater of Obama, right? That would be my guess. I haven't looked at it immediately, but the last time I looked at it, I'm pretty sure it was extremely like what you'd expect. Democrats love Biden and Republicans hate him.
Right? Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Sarah, did you want to say something?
I have a question, and then also something I thought was interesting. So, like, Trump and Reagan both have the same approval rating.
Yes.
But it's kind of interesting to look at the strongly versus some disapprove. Reagan is half of that. And then that was just something I wanted to point out, perhaps to those that can't see it. And then also, do you break down age cohorts when you're doing this? Because I just wonder, given people like to say there's a lot of polarization today amongst voters, if you're a younger person, would that influence how you would rank the presidents in terms of your strongly agree versus strongly disagree? Or would it potentially an older voter who potentially lived through some of these presidencies and might not have been raised in such a polarized environment be slightly more lenient?
Yeah, I mean, that's a dead-on question because, and I'll actually have further in the slide deck a breakdown among Democrats over and under 50 to show you some of those patterns. Among Republicans, it actually is a similar pattern where younger voters are more likely to say unsure for some of these. They're more likely to say approve for some actually controversial Democratic presidents. They still disapprove usually on net. But yes, the age difference does matter. And when we go to the slide among Democrats, you'll see it. But I was just reviewing actually some of our crosstabs, which everyone can find on our website and see those age breakdowns. Similar story where the unsure category grows with younger voters and older presidents, which you kind of expect, right? People who didn't grow up with Jimmy Carter immediately, their parents immediately talking about them or in their lifetime, they're probably less likely to take a strong stance on him. If you like, I can actually jump to a really cool visual we have showing how Republican and Democratic voters differ on the two presidents.
Sure, that'd be great. That'd be great.
Yeah, let me jump right here. So here is our fun little combo here. We got some visuals of presidents. Right off the bat, what do you notice in this graph? Like there's Trump and there's Obama, right? And they're these like big jagged lines. So the most recent presidents are the most controversial, right? They have the most polarization between parties. As you go further back, you go to Clinton, right? You go to GW, those start to, you have like a less sharp angle between the parties. And you'll notice on this chart here, we've got Republican net approval on the left and Democratic net approval on the right. The general trend is more recent, more controversial.
So for those of you who can't see our slides, what we're looking at is a graphic where on the left side is talking about the approval ratings by Republicans, and the right side is approval ratings for the same presidents for Democrats. And so what we'll see are these drastic, steep lines for the more recent presidents, right? So Trump has a high net approval rating on the right, but a low net approval rating on the left. And so it's this drastic difference. Same for Obama, but reversed. But as you go further and further back in time, the slope of these lines is getting flatter and flatter, where there's more and more agreement on the quality of old presidents, right? So, Kennedy is almost a flat line up at the top, whereas Ford is a flat line in the middle. And that's sort of a joke about Ford. He's basically a flat line everywhere if you watch Saturday Night Live in the 70s. But it's an interesting graphic, and I definitely encourage all of you. If you're listening to our podcast, you're interested in this sort of stuff, head over to Echelon Insights. But yeah, no, keep wowing us, Avery. Keep it going.
Yeah, absolutely. So this visual is pretty striking. I really like it. But then we get into an interesting break. So we have a survey question in our omnibus among Republican-leaning voters, about 500, right? Half of our omnibus. And we ask them if they consider themselves a Trump first or a Republican Party first Republican. So that is our question: Trump first or party first. And it's really helpful for us because then we can break that down in a lot of other survey questions, right? And that's when you're doing survey work, it's a really great tool. So what we did here is we broke down party first and Trump first. On this slide, just about Republican presidents, but you'll see some interesting trends in Democratic presidents too. Right off the bat, we have boxed here, and I'm just going to describe it for audio listeners. We pay particular attention to how George W. Bush and Donald Trump have this interesting break between the Trump first and the party first. I don't have the numbers right here. Trump first is a slightly smaller fraction of Republican-leaning voters. It's bounced around at like 35%, 38%. The larger chunk has been party first, well over 50%. But basically, among Trump first Republicans, it's like 97% approval of Trump. That makes complete sense with what that term means. Among party first Republicans, it's 81% approval of Donald Trump, which is still a 64-point margin. Let's not kid ourselves. But this is considerably smaller of a margin than Ronald Reagan, who's at 88% approval, an 81-point margin in approval among party first Republicans. So right off the bat, we can find here an interesting little wrinkle to how Republicans think about the latest Republican president, and even more interesting about George W. Bush, the second most recent. I saw you raising your hand there.
Yeah, just to explain for people what Avery means by net score, right? So you take and correct me if I'm wrong, you're taking the approval rating, what percent approve, minus those that strongly or somewhat
That's correct.
disapprove, right? So it's not just how many approve or how many don't,
Right.
This net idea. What is the function of that? Is it like, how do you guys view this idea of net, and
Yes.
why is it important?
Yes. So in surveys all the time, you'll have people who are not particularly passionate about an answer, right? You'll have people who say they're unsure. When you are surveying a figure like Joe Biden, or a topic like energy or abortion or what have you, knowing if the unsure or the don't know percentage is 5% or 20%, it adds very important context to a poll, right? If I were to tell you about, like Ford here on this poll, and I said, well, there's a 20-point approval among Trump first Republicans for Gerald Ford, you would have this impression in your mind of like, okay, so it's a closely divided, right? 20-point, that's 60-40. Well, you look right here, you'll notice 29% of them just said they're unsure, right? Ford is he's this older Republican president, caretaker, flat line, as you said, right? A lot of people, are just kind of in that middle. We got 46% approval for him, but 46% approval is a very different story than like neck to neck, 60% approval, 40% disapproval. So net is a very helpful way of kind of conceptualizing that phenomenon where people are not necessarily taking a side. And it gives an important context if you're talking about margins.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, because when you refer to it, I was trying to make sure it was a elucidate for people who aren't, math wizards. Yeah, so basically the big takeaway, it seems, from this slide is that amongst the party first, Reagan wins, right?
Yep.
But it's a close between W and Trump.
Yep.
Which would really piss off both W and Trump. Right?
That's
Am I right? Like,
that's right.
WB, he wants to paint a painting about this, how mad he is, right? Maybe like a dog frowning. And Trump wants to throw a sandwich at somebody. And so whereas the Trump first Republicans, they have 32% of them somewhat or strongly disapprove of George W. Bush.
Yes.
Right. So that's a big chunk of them. And that's the people who voted for Trump, who are either libertarian or maybe, union, blue collar job, who lost a friend or came back from Afghanistan, right? Who look at probably the war on terror as a huge mistake, is my guess.
Right.
But Trump has like a 97% approval rating with his fans, which is, why isn't it 100 if I'm a Trump first? That's interesting.
Yeah.
People are unique. People are interested. I'll tell you that.
Someone clicked the wrong button.
He needs to be more Trump, is what they're saying.
Well, that's why error. That's why margins of error exists. And actually, what is the margin of error here, Avery?
Yeah. So when we do margin of error here, I would say that particularly on this number, 64% approval for Bush and 97% approval for Trump, we're talking about a breakdown of a sample. So we got 1,000 voters. The margin of error is about 3.8, right? We have, of course, weights applied. So after weights, it's around 3.8, give or take. When we break it down further, if you have like a margin of error calculator, like you're going down to like 500. It's not a dramatic jump in margin of error, but as you go further down, you're like approaching 8, 10. We actually did a blog post on like UFO opinions, which was funny. And I talked to one of our modelers on exactly this question. Like, can you give me the margin of error for this subcategory? I don't have the immediate numbers in front of me, but what I will tell you is I'm very confident that George W. Bush, Donald Trump break among Trump first, we're talking probably an end sample of somewhere between 170 to 200 people. So the margin of error there is probably sufficient to say there's a statistically significant, 2 standard deviations.
Right.
Roll.
Yeah, because what at 1,023, which is the number, is your N for this. That's what, a 10% confidence interval, and then because 1,600 or so is about a 5%, if I recall. So it would make sense you cut that in half, and so that would make sense. And then you said you guys, which I want to talk about later, is you sort of mess with the sample to sort of create this likely voter demographic pool.
Right.
So that'll be interesting. But if you're listening and you're a mathy like some of us, what you heard there is out of 1,000 people, half were probably right leaning, but only 100 to 200 were forever Trumpers, right? And
That's
so the reliability of the Trump first column of data, if you're looking at this, is less reliable than the party first, right? The margin of error is larger on the right than on the
Yeah.
left, basically, because
Right.
we're talking 2/3 of 500, right? So,
Yeah.
okay.
Probably about 450, if I'm being honest, right? True independents are maybe 80 to 100 people in our overall sample. Yeah, so we have several questions that we calculate Republican leaning, right? Have you voted for previous, do you lean towards Republican candidates, etc. The most honest answer, of course, is like, are you a Republican? The people who say yes, they're instantly in the Republican leaning voter column. Then we have several other questions, which we create this category through.
Do you guys
So,
test
yeah.
for like hedging and lying? I know Gallup, like in their personality test, will like ding you if you're like sort of bipolar and answer the opposite. Like, are you looking for that? Because I know a lot of Trump voters will lie to pollsters.
So here's actually a really great question, which gives me an opportunity to brag about the company I work at, which is great. We just got like a couple of days ago, like last week, came out the 538 2021-2022 rankings. Echelon Insights, the polling firm that I worked for, made it to the top 5 in accuracy. And what I mean by accuracy is how closely we called the correct percentages for a race. So we were in the top 5. We did pretty well. We're very proud of that work. It doesn't come easily, right? There are polling firms, lots of polling firms, they range in quality. You'll have some that would like to do things in 2022, like say, well, we know Republicans were not answering polls in 2020, in 2018, 2016, right? We know that we were missing something then. There was a real error in 2016 in the Midwest, right? Polling error across the board. So there is a temptation where sometimes it's like people will say, oh, there must be missing voters. There must be this missing voter that we can't see in 2022. But what we learned in 2022 is the polls worked. I mean, we generally had no giant statistical error in the polls with the actual results. It goes to show that, like, when it comes to the statistical work, if you want reliable clients, if you want to be talking to journalists about this stuff, you want to make sure your polls actually have the results, that you see the end game where, okay, this is what we were projecting, this is what we got. So we're really proud of our work with our likely electorate model in 2022, getting us to like the top 5 in accuracy on 538's review of these electorate. And I think that's a really great accomplishment for us, but we're not going to rest on our laurels, obviously. We're going to put in the work in 2024, and that modeling is really important. I, as a research analyst, do not play as large a role in the model designing. I handle a lot more of the work with the omnibus numbers than the model design, but I can tell you some of the basic ideas around, how we're looking at projecting what the 2024 likely electorate looks like. I'll remind your viewers and listeners, this poll we're doing is of likely voters. We are aiming for the people who are going to vote in 2024. That's what we're trying to aim for. What do they think about former presidents and job approval? So general public is not necessarily our sample target, which it might be for other people, right? There's plenty of other polls that want the general public at large. But we know voters can be a little different.
But hang on, we're gonna turn it over to Sarah real quick. I know she had her hand up.
Yeah, I have one question. I have 2 things. The first one's like kind of directed to both Terry and Avery, because Terry asked, do people lie on polls? And I was just kind of curious because and like research methods and designs courses, one of the things that you can learn is that typically internet-based ones tend to be more honest because just social pressures, people will answer differently with an in-person interviewer versus on a computer. So I was just wondering, like, you taking that into account? Does your polling firm, do you ever interview people in person or is it all online? And then I don't remember what my second one was, something like that. But yeah, just tell us how you get your polls, and then how are you crafting your likely electorate? That was my second question. How do you go through that? What goes into it?
Sure. And Terry, if you wanted to add something in, I can answer all this.
No, that was my exact question. I was wondering, how are you reaching out to people? Is this text? Is it a phone call? Are you calling my grandma at her house? Like, how does this work?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is it depends on the client, right? So some polling we've done for clients, right, we'll have a mix of text, phone, landline, cell, right, and online. For the omnibus, we're doing online. So this is online polling. We're looking at a sample of over 1,000 voters. You'll notice I say voters, so we're actually matching these people to voter records, right? When we're running basically creating the surveys, we're basically making sure that you do not proceed with the survey unless we can match you to a real voter record with the zip code that you gave. So that's part of how, you know, we're basically reaching out and looking right off the bat that we're making sure we'll find people who will actually be voting in 2024.
Are they compensated?
It depends on the work. It depends on the work we're doing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, I can't get into the details of exactly the, you know, client by client stuff. But yeah, like online polling is definitely a world of like where you want to make sure you're both getting people who are representative of the general public, and then you're able to weight it accurately, right? And the weighting is important because, as we all know, like voters differ a bit from the general public, and they can even differ, of course, from the sample you're getting online. So we like to be looking at models of just regionally and many other variables that previous trends have shown in 2022, 2020 can inform our decision of what this might look like in 24. Andy, you have a question?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Avery. Well, not necessarily a question, but one thing I kind of want to point out. I know we're focusing on George W. Bush and Donald Trump on this, but I want to take a look at the Ronald Reagan section, both at Party First and Trump First. I mean, I think it really shows, you know, for people who don't know, is that it still seems that, you know, Ronald Reagan is the god in the GOP, regardless of, you know, wherever you fall, whether you find yourself the Trump Republican or Party First Republican. So while they may disagree, you know, on a lot of things, it still seems that Reagan is still carrying that torch with him.
So
If I could,
go
I
ahead.
could
Go ahead,
back-
Ben. Yeah.
I could bring back to the Bush versus Trump wrinkle that we were discussing, and particularly the Trump first voters. If you dig into the crosstabs here, is there a particular demographic, you know, whether it be by age, income, gender, something that shows where this breakdown of Trump first voters, in particularly the disapproval of George Bush, where that comes from? If there's a, you know, single characteristic that we could pin that down on?
Yeah, so I don't have that immediate information. It would definitely be in our crosstabs and in our like actual like full data set. My general read of this is from what I know of our other omnibus breaks when we're looking at like Trump, DeSantis, and you know, that's like the big questions people have on the primary polling. On the DeSantis Trump breaks, and those are available on our website as well for February, for January, for December. We've been doing this for a bit. Those skew with like education towards DeSantis, income towards DeSantis, you know, several of those variables skew. So I can't say for certain what the Trump first, Party First break is. And I don't want to like exaggerate it. Like Party First is still 81% approval for Trump, right? There's not like a huge difference in the grand scheme of things, but it is an interesting fact. And you make a good point that yes, Trump first voters probably do differ a bit in several variables. And I did like Terry's kind of speculation on this. While I don't have good data on it immediately, it's totally true to our knowledge that like Trump's big difference was winning these Midwestern states, which in particular were very receptive to messages about trade, immigration. And if you remember the 2016 primary, I mean, Trump got into a fight about Iraq. That was a real debate he had with Jeb. So yeah, I think that speculation, well, I can't back it with the polling I'm presenting, is worth digging into. It's an interesting phenomenon. If you want, I can go to another slide on here that we have.
Well, that's fine. All right, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, because I don't want to like miss out on sharing some of this stuff. We've got
What about
Trump
the
first
Democrat
Republicans.
ones that you mentioned earlier?
Yes, we have those ahead. I can jump to those if you want. I mean, I don't want to spend the entire time on the deck, so happy to go with the conversation. So like I can do a quick rundown if you want of some of these slides. Like the titles are pretty
Yeah, we'll leave you.
straightforward.
We're gonna leave you alone. You give us the rundown, and then at the end,
Yeah.
we're just all nerding out here.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I know.
I know your listeners might not be as beloved with an hour just straight of Trump first versus Party First, as much as I might like to do that. Yes, so Trump first Republicans we found were more likely to approve of Bill Clinton, which is interesting. And we also found that Party First Republicans are just net even on LBJ, 36 approved, 36 disapproved, 28 unsure. Not the case with Trump First, negative 23 net approval. Yeah, Bill Clinton, significant to see that bump. We're going to go to Democrats. For the Democrats, we decided to do a break between over 50 Democratic leaning voters and under 50. Here, when we look at the breaks, you can clearly see these like older presidents you have uncertainty around. So Democratic leaning voters under 50, a lot more unsure about Ford. You know, right off the bat, 44% that kind of sticks out. Whereas older Democratic voters, they like Ford. They thought President Ford was fine at 55% approval, and then like 27% disapprove, 18% in the middle. The one quick break I'll put here to really point out, Nixon and Trump, younger Democrats, of course, disapprove of them overwhelmingly. 57% disapprove of Nixon, 82% disapprove of Trump. But for Democratic leaning voters under 50, we found 24% approve of Nixon and 16% approve of Trump, which are some interesting deviations from older Democratic voters. That's just a fun thing that stuck out to us. Then we go to Democratic presidents for Democratic leaning voters. Barack Obama, top of the list, 93% approval, whether you're under 50 or you're over 50. The Carter and Johnson, you can clearly see here a breakdown where younger voters are more unsure. So you've got Democratic leaning voters under 50 are 31% unsure about Carter, so 51% approve, 18% disapprove. With the older ones, it's way more strongly approve at 79%, strongly or somewhat. And then for LBJ, older Democratic voters, the margin's 45 points in favor of approving of him. For Democrats who are under 50, it's a margin of 12 points, which is interesting. That's not because they're like super divided either. 34% approval, 22% disapproval, and then 44% is the plurality in the middle on LBJ's legacy, his job, how he did as president. Then we did some fun things on the favorites. You know, what's your favorite Republican president since JFK? So Reagan is at 42% for Republican leaning. Trump, 47%, wins the plurality very narrowly, but that's basically the field. The rest are very, very small. You go to Democratic leaning, Reagan is the plurality win. 31% of Democratic leaning voters say Reagan's their favorite Republican president. The next runner-up is none of these. And we took out unsure here, but unsure is a pretty small percentage. So that's an interesting finding. Then we have favorite Democratic president. Okay, Barack Obama sweeps it, 61% among Democratic leaning voters. Among Republican leaning voters, it's JFK all the way. 50% put him as their favorite. And then, of course, you can see here on the slide I'm presenting overall, right? We're talking 35% Obama, 32% Kennedy. So it's an interesting break. And then, yeah, I mean, generally, you've got Clinton, Carter, Johnson kind of picking up the end here. None of these was 15% for Republican leaning. So Democratic leaning voters were more likely to pick none of these for Republican presidents. And let me see, that is all. So I'm happy to answer any questions on any of the slides.
So I wonder in some of this, how do you account for people who under Trump left the Democratic Party? So now they identify maybe as Trump first or Republican first.
Sure.
But before they didn't. Do you guys have any sort of questions that maybe, or if you don't, you might want to add that to your methodology to sort of pick that out?
Yeah, I mean, we're really interested in just knowing what the likely electorate in 2024 is, but this is a good question. The way we calculate our Republican and Democratic leaning voters, the lean factor to it involves asking people, do they vote on the whole more often for Republican presidents, Republican politicians, more often for Democratic politicians. So we have ways of just generally sussing that out. But right, it does get interesting when you're asking things like movement. I think one thing just worth talking about that perhaps is now a little underrated sometimes is like the Republican coalition's shift from Romney to Trump is on the margin. You know, we're talking overwhelmingly most of the same voters. So taking out that very, very tiny movement is important to talking about how 2016 happened and how 2020 almost went to Trump. I mean, it was a very close election, but it's not in terms of like 10,000 feet up talking about the likely electorate. It's not a huge movement. right? So it's one of those things where, like, yeah, those tiny movements are a big deal. We obviously want to know what percentage of Americans are going to vote for a given president, but yeah, tiny slivers like that, it's you definitely need to do some very good sampling and some good guesses about several
because
ideological choices.
yeah, let's be honest, it was tiny slivers that won him the election in Wisconsin or wherever, right? And so it, to me, it seems like if we look at approval ratings for, say, Ronald Reagan now versus before, I'd be really interested to see how those union voters who were probably leaning Democrat, center left when Reagan was president, but are now behind Trump, and do they buy into that narrative? You know, I think I'm the only one on the panel who's lived through the Reagan administration. Right, I was born during Carter's presidency, and so it's interesting, you know, being raised a Republican and being, I was president of the College Republicans. I grew up on the right, and Reagan was the guy, and maybe it's my exposure to academia, but that viewpoint is somewhat undermined based on some of our activities, say in Central and South America, or some of our prolific spending during that period as I've become a little bit more libertarian. It's interesting though. Yeah, Ben.
Well, now that you bring up Reagan, I thought an interesting takeaway from the slides that Avery shared was we talked about the breakdown of George W. Bush versus Donald Trump and their approval ratings. But if you looked at the Reagan slide there, it was essentially the same, right? For people who identify as GOP voters first versus people who identify as Trump voters first. So I think Reagan, still really is the man in the Republican Party. I think maybe some people who identify as the Trump first, they might have a little more fervor, but I wouldn't write off, Ronald Reagan's legacy quite yet.
Oh, well, no, I think, look, the romanticism of his legacy, if we take Reagan's legacy and we look at the pluses, I think it's a really powerful tool for Republicans to win future elections. I think if you can take the good time, because every president does things right and does things wrong, and every one of those mistakes or good choices are made in the context of that period. And look, like Clinton was one of the luckiest presidents of all time. Anybody who doesn't recognize that being president during the internet boom, right? A lot of those decried Reagan policies of trickle-down economics came home to roost during Clinton's administration. And so that's an unpopular opinion, but the math is the math. And so I think that some of this matters. I'm interested in that, the legend of Reagan, right? So Reagan was the guy. Everybody, I don't know if, you guys are all politically active, but every presidential candidate, when asked during a debate, who do you liken yourself after? Who's your favorite? Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan. Reagan's my favorite, right? And so, sorry if that was really loud. I got close to the microphone there. But yeah, so I think that was really interesting. How about you, Sarah? Are you a big Reagan fan? No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead, ask your question.
That's a funny question. Am I? I don't know. That's the tell.
I don't think you're going to tell us. I have a feeling.
No.
I think all of us know, but we're going to let her spill the beans.
No, the thing about Reagan, for one, he was kind of like the peak of that movement that had been going on. As Avery can tell you more about. In the peak of that movement, the conservative movement of the Cold War era. So of course, he's going to be popular. He's going to be remembered well. I do kind of wonder though, to Terry's point about academia, I think it does kind of change you because for one, you read more and you learn how to read more closely. I'd be curious, and you're in the Trump first people and your poll, I'd be curious to look at their educational background because everybody's entitled to their own opinions. But I would say perhaps it's just being in this city and academics, it does kind of change the way you look at things, and it tends to moderate people a little bit.
Yeah, Terry, I was curious, could you share a little bit more about your time growing up? You were in Southern California, is that correct?
For the most part, I lived up by you for a minute. I was in Davis for a couple of years. Okay. I walked out of middle school on Earth Day to protest the Gulf War, even though I was a big fan. And they were screaming kill George H.W. Bush at UC Davis. But yeah, okay, please ask me your question.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious. I mean, I think that it is definitely true that Reagan is an interesting figure in part because there's lots of little wrinkles that people forget about, right? I mean, I think that he also is known for appointing, pretty socially conservative people to some positions. He's sometimes in a strange way caricatured, and I'm thinking now of an excellent essay by the professor Sam Goldman here at GW in DC about the myth of an immaculate Reagan. He wrote this for The Week, and he said, like, in some ways there's like people on the right and people in more liberal kind of left circles who think of Reagan as just this orthodox tax cutting libertarian, and like that's just basically it. And the reality is like really kind of more complicated than that, right? He put a ton of tariffs on Japanese cars, basically, or like anti-dumping rules. He he pivoted to like a lot of Reagan Democrats, a lot of people who were out in this part of the country who were looking at their creeping, up the tax brackets of inflation, and at the same time had lots of opinions on all sorts of things other than taxes. And I think that you make a good point here on like just that Reagan is kind of simplified. So I am curious, growing up, what experience you had with people who supported him.
I mean, I was born in 78, right?
Yeah.
So I was a baby when Reagan was elected. But I grew up in a Reagan house. And, it was just me and my mom growing up. And so we, she treated me more like an adult talking news and politics at the dinner table since I was like 8. It's interesting because in the moment, it was a lot of us versus them, right? It was very Cold War. And I mean, the Olympics were so much better during the Cold War, guys. It was so good. Like, it was like, hey, we don't have to nuke them. We can just beat them at hockey. It was so good. Like, you rooted so hard against the CCP gymnasts. It was great. But Reagan had a lot of things going for him. He was a Republican governor from America's best state. Sorry. And he was a charming actor, right? Like, so he could keep you from, as a politician, he could wow you in his ability to speak. He had very strong roots in his conservatism. Like, whether or not he governed this way, the way he talked was a brand. And so it's that brand that people fell in love with. If you look at the prolific spending of the Reagan administration, it's not in brand. If you look at different interventions, it's not in brand, but it also was the demands of the time. And so part of the Reagan lore is he's not going to hold it against his opponent that he's so youthful and inexperienced. Part of it is his charm. Part of it is, it was really the end of bipartisanship. He was the last president who had a willing partner with Tip O'Neill. That's not true because Newt and Bill actually worked really hard to work together, but it wasn't painted that way in the 90s. So politics wasn't the lens we looked through in the 80s. We did not look through everything through this partisan skepticism that we have today. And so I think Reagan could be this romanticized figure that couldn't really exist today with the 24-hour news cycle. Right? If George W. Bush had been president from 1980 to 1988, I think we'd love him just as much as Reagan, even though he would have screwed up just as much as he did, because he wouldn't have been called a Nazi. Like, literally, he was called a Nazi every day. Keith Olbermann ended his show with the number of people who died in Iraq every night, and those are all reasonable things. And we didn't take that seriously enough hindsight. But no, the romanticism of the 80s, during the 80s, he was the last sort of president who got the benefit of the doubt that all presidents before him had gotten. Now it's just straight up, down and dirty, everything, everybody's gotten Olivia Pope and it's all public. And we're all assuming everybody's got an Olivia Pope. And it's much more we live in a reality show than we live in this romanticism of American politics.
Terry,
And
bringing
that's,
it back
yeah,
to
go ahead. Yeah.
present day and tying in the echelon poll here, I would be interested to know if well, two-part question here for Avery. One, do you break your polls down at the state level? And then two, if you do, I'd be interested to know in some of these early primary states, like New Hampshire, Iowa,
Sure.
South Carolina, the states that are really going to determine whether Donald Trump is successful or not in reclaiming the nomination in 2024. Is there anything that you see in those states that would indicate, his approval is higher there on net than it would be, throughout the country, or, it could be lower? Anything that would, provide some insight for the people listening about what they could possibly expect in the upcoming primary season?
Yeah, well, so I can only talk about our public work with the omnibus, and what I will say, of course, is the omnibus is a national poll. So we're looking 10,000 feet up. What does the 2024 electorate look like? 1,000 so people.
The popular vote. So
Right.
that's my goal.
So that is an important thing to consider. I mean, I think these are really good questions. What I would say is that there is definitely been an interesting, trend I've seen just in online polls like we do in YouGov, but also I believe I saw a little bit of a break in one of Fox's polls using phones that suggested some degree of age shift here, where you'd have older Republicans leaning a little bit less Trumpy, a little bit more DeSantis. But I can't really say this early out what those states are going to look like. I mean, I think it's really fascinating to think about how in a funny way, like, the Republicans are not the brand of like the policy wonks, right? The Democratic Party gets this reputation for being far more concerned with policy, far more detail oriented on lots of new plans. You saw this in the 2020 primary, right? But what is interesting is the Democrats now have an incumbent president. They have Joe Biden, and they have a policy record of 2 years, and they have to, looking forward to 2024, make the case for what they're doing. And I think the Republicans are in a position where people aren't, I think, finding grand policy kind of differences. They're talking more about the poetry. But in a funny way, it kind of concentrates the mind on policy because there's just so little of it, right? There's so little discussion of some of it that, you have Trump talk about freedom cities. I don't know what that's going to look like, but
Flying cars,
right? VTOL, that's great. But I think with these states, it's really early to know. What is remarkable, of course, is that DeSantis is polling as high as he is without even announcing a run. I mean, that's really interesting. I think it might have been Nate Cohn at the New York Times who reported on basically how this early out, the people who poll as high as Trump and DeSantis currently are
Lose.
overwhelmingly, well, they're like overwhelmingly the people who like probably become the nominee for the party, right? I mean, like that's basically it. If you're at 30-something% over a year out from the first primary, the trends are just overwhelmingly pointing towards that historically.
Oh, see, I thought it was the opposite. Like Rudy was the leader at this point years ago. Like I thought it was generally the early people peak early, like Howard Dean or
Sure.
not, but maybe I'm wrong there.
I think once you hit like 35%, once you're talking about bigger numbers, it's a different story. I agree. You've seen this in 2012. You've seen this in different cycles. You remember when Kamala had that real bump after the first debate, stuff like that.
I mean, I would have put money on her.
Right. So I think like the big question is a year out before even like a primary is going to happen. Yeah, the field is nothing is certain. But I thought Cohn's reporting on that was pretty sharp. I mean, he's a pretty good data journalist on this. Like, yeah, this is the numbers you'd expect with Reagan in 80, Obama in 08. Like these are like big heavy hitters. So DeSantis is doing quite remarkably. What I will say, of course, and we're not the only polling firm to find it, there's now been a bit more of a dip since November, December. There's a little bit more space now opening up between him and Trump. And you can find that online on our public deck that we have with our crosstabs.
If we're taking a wide view mode here, the field looks a lot different, or I shouldn't say the field, but the status of the primary looks a lot different than it would, let's say, at this point in 2016, where you had support scattered amongst 8 to 10 to 12 candidates, which kind of, allowed Donald Trump to consolidate his base and then win a number of states early on in those primaries. You would say 2024, and obviously not, to put you on the spot or get into specifics, but in general, the field, it's essentially a binary choice at this point between likely nominees.
Well, so I can't rule anything out, I mean, I work for a Republican leaning polling firm, right? We're looking at this stuff, and there's no like certain story, right? There are definitely stories of people at 5% jumping up to a higher percentage, right? There's all sorts of things, and we're not even talking about the VP ticket for the nominee, et cetera. I would hesitate to like rule something out this early. I think there's obviously lots of room for speculation. What I will say is Nate Cohn's piece is pretty great, right? Where he's talking about that big heavy hitter and polling. He says that that's a big deal historically. I think that's worth giving a look. Does that explain everything? Not necessarily. It's still a ways out. And I think what is interesting about DeSantis, perhaps, what I will venture as some commentary on him, is he's the governor of a state. If you wind the clock back to the 2016 primary, right before New Hampshire, you might remember that time that Chris Christie just like beat the crap out of Rubio on the debate stage. Yeah, I know some people who worked at Rubio's office. Like Rubio's a smart guy. It was a nasty brawl on TV. But the point being made about how a governor has to make executive calls and work with the legislature in a way that a senator doesn't, that's just flat out true, right? When you govern a state, you are creating policy, you are making decisions all the time. I leave it to the listener to decide if that's a liability or a positive for DeSantis, but it's something worth pointing out that he is the governor of an enormous state, one of the biggest in the country. And he has both a record of re-election, and he has as well a policy record, which he is, last I checked in the news, going to California, to Iowa, to lots of states, and really opening with that argument that he has, I think to borrow words from his book, like a blueprint for freedom, right? He believes he has plans, he has policy ideas that will interest primary voters. And that's what's interesting about DeSantis, is that he's the governor of a major state. I think that's something that people should look into more.
And he's flipped voters as well. I believe in his most recent election as well, which was quite unique as well. And so I think surprised many folk.
Yeah, the red wave was witnessed strongly in Florida and in New York State. That was a big story, I think, that's been covered. Yeah.
So let me tee this up maybe for next time. We've been talking a lot of numbers at throwing them at people. We've seen some tendencies, but hopefully we can get Avery back and pick his brain and your guys' brain on this idea. We're in the game. We're in the game right now talking about what X's, what O's, who's got the better ground game, who's going to have the strategy. What's missing for me, the romantic political observer, is the message. I haven't seen anyone come out and try and change somebody's mind. Right? When I worked at the McCain campaign, it was GOTV, go get out the vote. Go find the people who we know are going to vote for John and get them to the polls. Can DeSantis, can Trump, can Biden, can Haley, and anybody else who announces between now and then, where are the leaders trying to lead? Telling us the tough truths, challenging us to change how we live or believe. Is that even possible today? These are the questions I would love to have Avery back if he'll come, and maybe we can discuss those next time. What are those questions? What are those challenges that if you were at the top of a ticket or if you were advising somebody, what would you be challenging people? Because I think that's what's missing. I think Trump wasn't tough love. He was just sort of tough. But I think we're missing this sort of accountability from our leaders that are like, hey, we're in this, like John F. Kennedy's ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. That moment was a challenge for Americans to step up. And I wonder if there is somebody out there, whether it's preaching tolerance of transgender or morality against it, whatever it is, right? There's all these real interesting issues floating out there about how people live, who they are, what issues face the country, what really matters to your neighbors. Can a leader tell us we're wrong and win? Can they hold us accountable? I'd be really interesting. I'm really interested in exploring that with you guys maybe next time. What do you guys think?
I think that's fantastic. Now I get a bunch of thoughts in my head. I want to talk, but I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to note them down.
So write them down. We'll try and get Avery back. We're going to try and get Avery to convince the number crunchers at his team to maybe run a poll for us or something. We'll see on something like this. We'll see.
With him promoting his company, I see he's trying to get that promotion. So maybe.
I mean, he is an excellent salesman, and all 8 of our listeners are going to go to Echelon and check out.
We got
their
21 Spotify followers, so
right. EchelonInsights.com, check it out. But yeah, no, it's been great to be on, and Terry, yeah, I think it's a great closer. I think it's a good thing to look forward to in the future. So I'll let you know if I'm free. It's been great to talk with you guys.
That'd be great, and again, we're really appreciative of your time, your openness to questions. Ben, Sarah, thanks for holding them accountable and asking cool questions. Same with you, Andrew. Thanks for hosting and keeping us on track, on schedule, and keeping me from getting too crazy. But yeah, this was a really interesting conversation. If you are a Politico, if you're not, I definitely recommend, if you're listening right now and not watching, if you made it this far, congratulations. But definitely go check out the YouTube video where you can see the graphics, or maybe rewind a bit and open up the omnibus study from Echelon, and we'll go from there. But again, everybody be safe, healthy, and we look forward to talking to you again in a couple of weeks.
So good night, everyone.
See you guys.